Welcome to Medmarc's webinar series. Today's presentation is titled Changing Policies and Attitudes, Impacts on Medical Product Litigation. I'm Kate Klaus, Senior Attorney in Medmarc's Risk Management Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenters, thank you for joining us. We are fortunate to have a panel of experts from the law firm Holland Knight joining us today. Eric Alexander is a partner in Holland Knight's Washington, D.C. office, and he leads the firm's product liability life sciences litigation team. Megan Mocho is a partner in the Tyson's office, specializing in white-collar and False Claims Act investigations and defense, and she co-leads the firm's National Security and Defense Industry Group. Juliet McBride is a partner in the firm's Houston office and a member of the Healthcare Regulatory and Enforcement Practice Group, focused on healthcare compliance and government investigations. And Sara Klock is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office and a member of the Public Policy and Regulation Group, focused on food, agriculture, drug and device, digital health, and life sciences. And with that, I am pleased to turn things over to Eric.
Good afternoon, everybody. We're very happy to present this to you. I'll say part of the idea that we had when we were approached about this was let's bring together a group of people with different backgrounds. As was just explained, we have pretty different backgrounds in terms of what we do on a day-to-day basis, but we all interact with life sciences, medical device, drug, et cetera, companies in this space in various ways. And one of the things that seems like a important topic these days is as things have been changing in various aspects of government policies over the last year or so, both FDA and CMS, we see the ripples in terms of investigations, criminal and civil litigation that comes out of those, private litigation, a range of things, and it's all kind of interconnected. So we wanted to make sure we brought to you a panel that would look at some of these things from different angles. And we're going to start by kind of digging into the straight up regulatory changes. And I'm going to start off with Sara here, who is our FDA specialist.
Thanks, Eric, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining. I think before we get to the meat of the presentation about the litigation risk trends exposure, it's helpful to just level set from an FDA's perspective, since most of the products we're talking about, if not all, are regulated by the FDA. And it'll come to no surprise to anybody on this call that the FDA today is not the same FDA that existed a year ago or just historic. There's some things that are the same and a lot of things that are not the same under the Trump administration. And to level set here, historically, I think the FDA has not been as impacted directly by an administration as it is today, from top down, from the president to the HHS secretary down to the FDA, and there hasn't been as much hand-holding between HHS and FDA, I think, than currently. So what we wanted to highlight here is really what we're seeing from an enforcement perspective, some new practices that the FDA has engaged in the last year, and then some predictions. So from an enforcement standpoint, typically an entity has FDA enforcement through one, an inspection, and then two, failing that inspection for various reasons, or a recall or some sort of safety issue hazard. And the first bullet we have on this slide is about FDA's issuance of warning and untitled letters. And that is not an uncommon practice, but the way the agency has deployed this, particularly in the fall of 2025, is abnormal. They essentially sent thousands of letters to drug manufacturers, advertisers, telehealth companies, drug compounders, saying that your marketing is not legal, you are going beyond what your label says or what you have been approved to say. And FDA sent 100 cease and desist letters out to companies. And it is the first time FDA has done this, and the way they did it is not typical of how drug advertisements get gets enforced, which kind of goes to the last bullet on this page about governing via press releases and statements. So FDA just blasted companies with this. We haven't seen much enforcement after these letters have been received, but they are out there in the public domain and on FDA's radar. The second bullet under enforcement is increased inspections, and not just increased inspections, but the scrutiny that manufacturers are being placed under when FDA is present in that facility. FDA has taken a lot of enforcement, really the last 6 months, on over-the-counter drug manufacturers, in particular, API manufacturers, that I think would have been normal course observations when FDA issued that 483 that are raising to more material issues. I think manufacturers think these are paperwork issues or minor issues, and the FDA is saying, no, it is more than paperwork. It is more than normal course issues. And rather than closing out those initial inspections with corrective action plans to address those 483s, they're moving into meetings with the FDA, additional enforcement, potential recalls of products that I think 2 years ago under FDA would have just been a closeout of an inspection. And then the last bucket under enforcement, which should also come to no surprise, is just increased foreign manufacturer oversight. That is just true domestically, but even more so in foreign markets. The two practices we've highlighted here are the issuance of CRL letters and the use of AI systems. From an FDA perspective, and the number of drug approvals, I believe, was slightly down in 2025 versus 2024 and 2023. But even if it was flat or above, we're seeing FDA issue letters to sponsors saying that you're not going to be able to bring your product to the market for reasons that they otherwise wouldn't have used. And I recognize that this is sponsor dependent, but rather than dig into the meat of the issue or call up the sponsor and work through the issue, FDA is just issuing CRLs rather than further reviewing that. It's our understanding this may be due to lack of resources from the FDA, but it is something that if you're bringing a product through development, you should be aware of. Also, just flagging here, FDA's use of AI. It's from scrubbing the internet for advertisements all the way through review, an initial review of a drug or device application, and the agency is leaning heavy on that. And it's important to make sure whatever you're putting out, either in the public domain or from an FDA perspective, is following what the FDA is saying and has said. And then the last two things with predictions. I will say we expect that the interplay between the administration, HHS, and FDA to continue. And everyone is aware of Biosecure and the increased push for domestic manufacturing and FDA's enforcement on foreign manufacturers. So we only actually expect that to anticipate. So moving production ex-US to US is, I think, of top priority in the FDA. And then FDA the last year has issued a lot of press statements and are governing through either draft guidance or press release or podcasts. And I don't anticipate that ending anytime soon. I will turn it over to my colleague, Juliet, to talk about CMS now.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm excited about this webinar because we are taking such a different view with respect to how this all could affect the end manufacturer at the end of the day. And the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is oftentimes an administrative agency just viewed as, oh, they run the Medicare and Medicaid program. What they have going on might not be as relevant for me in my day-to-day as a manufacturer, even a distributor. But because CMS does have oversight of payment, increasingly we're seeing a fixation on not only the medical services that are being performed, but the products that are being used as part of that medical service that's going to be reimbursed. And that's kind of been the focal point over the past year, or more than the past year, frankly, And we'll talk about how we're kind of seeing that right now. On the enforcement front, there's been explosive growth with respect to the use of certain types of cell tissue products, also referred to as skin substitutes, in the market. Because of that expansive growth over a short period of time and increased use, which we're happy about, it means the products are working, patients are getting better. That's meant increased spending on the part of the Medicare program. And you'll see reports, some of still just 6 months ago coming out about this expansive spend on these types of products and how that's become the focal point to get that money back to the program where they feel like spending has been sort of out of bounds. So along those lines, you'll see CMS head up through its other contractors program integrity audits. These are audits going to healthcare providers, clinicians, and the like, and often resulting in money being taken back to the Medicare program. Why is the product at issue? Oftentimes, some of the services involve products that are the subject of the key reimbursement. Along those similar lines, CMS has made very clear that they're kind of reevaluating what does it mean and how are we really viewing average sales prices that are put together for purposes of drugs and biologics that hit the market? And how can we curtail the process to make sure that we are relying on relevant data that goes into that average sales price methodology? Again, this has been put at the forefront because of the cell tissue product market, in that there was a pretty significant variance in price for arguably similar types of products, ranging from hundreds to multiple thousands for similar types of products, some may argue. But that has increased that lens again on data and how we're relying on it and how it's going to end up being paid for by the program. Another area of enforcement includes CMS's sort of heightened focus and commitment towards this whole discount program agreement that they've entered into with certain manufacturers, which imposes a requirement to extend a discount for certain types of drugs, and really evaluating whether or not those discounts are appropriately being administered and passing down. So these enforcement initiatives really are driving some of the practices that we're seeing in turn. CMS has consistently said under this current administration, at the helm with Dr. Oz at the top, that their goal is to make America healthy again. And what does that mean? To a certain extent, they said it means really dialing back on some of the spending. And so we're seeing that occur. An increased reliance on technology and really doubling down on healthcare services that focus on more efficient care and cost containment care. And, with respect to some of these practices, we can't really separate them all too much from the enforcement because they do go hand in hand. To comment on one particular practice that's effective as of this month, CMS has started what is called a program to evaluate spending before the service is performed, called a WISER program in certain states. And at the helm of those services that are being evaluated, most of them tie back to products, whether it's the evaluation of skin substitutes or the evaluation of products used for knee replacements, medical devices used for purposes of other types of surgeries are going to be evaluated on the front end before they decide whether or not they'll pay for it. So we'll talk more about our predictions as we get further along in the presentation, but really wanted to emphasize in this realm how payment and how CMS can have a really direct effect on the manufacturer community, especially when certain products might be called into question and may not be reimbursed by the program as a manufacturer had intended, and has how the end user or your customer might be expecting to be reimbursed for the use of it.
Wanted to talk a little bit about the changes on the enforcement side, and we're speaking specifically to DOJ or OIG. A lot of these have been sort of baking over the last year or so, so you've probably heard about a little of them, but we can talk about what we're seeing. Specific to this group, obviously there is a new working group, and that working group is CMS program integrity. We've got HHS, Office of General Counsel. We've got HHS OIG Council, DOJ Civil, and various members of the U.S. Attorney's offices, select offices that are perhaps more active in the healthcare space. And they are getting together and coordinating. This was something that was revived by Brenda Jenny, who is the new head over there. And their goal is to talk through things that cross these various paths. So they have talked about areas of enforcement in specifically when they issued. So they are looking at drug, device, or biologic pricing, including arrangements for discounts, rebates, service fees, and formulary placement price reporting. So that was identified by them. Kickbacks, obviously on there. And then this one, materially defective medical devices that impact patient safety. So they're calling attention to this patient focus, similar to what Sara and Juliet have been talking about previously. Another group that has been developed is this DOJ Civil Division Enforcement and Affirmative Litigation branch. And as described, it has two different sections. So you've got the enforcement section and the affirmative litigation section. Focusing on the enforcement side, they are looking at cases under the Controlled Substances Act, under the Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act, as well as under the Consumer Product Safety Act. So again, we're doing patient-focused enforcement based on the particular industry. On the criminal side, I know we were talking about litigation, but it's always relevant what's going on the criminal side because they tend to run in parallel. So when the criminal division issued its priorities, I think a lot of people were expecting there to be a decrease in enforcement, and I think we haven't necessarily seen that on our edges. We are definitely full in on enforcement, both criminal and civil. And the first priority identified in their memorandum was healthcare. So it remains something that is very important, top of the list for the criminal side. And they sort of buttressed that when they added healthcare programs to the corporate whistleblower pilot program that they announced. Now, it's unique in that this corporate whistleblower awards pilot program relative to health insurance relates to private insurance claims. So they are sort of specifically carving out what would otherwise be a False Claims Act or that type of litigation. And they're looking for instances where there is fraud on non-public payers. And then they're expanding the healthcare fraud strike force into Massachusetts. I don't think anybody's surprised there. It's a very active office when it comes to healthcare enforcement. And then on the administrative side, I think what we're seeing are we've seen this frequently on the government contract side when they're dealing with administrative agreements. But when we start talking about the corporate integrity agreements, we're seeing more and more bespoke provisions being called out. So for example, let's say you have a company that is being tagged for violations of cybersecurity rules affecting patient or user data. Now we're going to IROs, independent review organizations, as part of the CIA, specific to your IT security and your data privacy practices. And so we're getting very granular on what we're expecting for you. And I don't think it's surprising. It's just a trend that we're definitely seeing. And then a leverage of additional resources when it comes to suspension, debarment, exclusion. They also have revocation and preclusion, which are starting to come out more and more.
So now we're on to maybe like the next step. I think of the big plaintiffs lawyers in product liability litigation, particularly for drug and device, a little like sharks circling for something. And so when the government does something, they put some chum in the water, either by the sort of FDA actions that Sara was talking about, something that I'm not sure I've ever seen before, like Megan was talking about, where the government refers to approved or cleared legally marketed medical devices as being materially defective, or even the stuff Juliet's talking about actions relating to payment and sales and marketing practices. Any of that can be chum for creating large scale product liability litigation. If you look at the ones over the last 10 years or so, sometimes there's a discrete FDA action or change in regulatory status, a big study, whatever, to spawn a new litigation. But often there isn't. Often it relates to a coordinated, public citizen filing, a citizen's petition, some sort of action like that. But what really drives this stuff is money. So most large scale litigations in this country relating to medical products are funded. And so the companies that make money off of funding litigation certainly do what we're doing here, which is look at the litigation environment and think, is this a good time to invest? Looking forward however many years, are things going on right now that are going to make us give the plaintiffs' lawyers and their consortiums money to do a bunch of advertising, get a bunch of cases, and file a bunch of big proceedings that turn into MDLs or other coordinated proceedings. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of years, but it's pretty easy to look into the crystal ball, I think, given the actions of the last year, is that there are some, maybe previously off limits sort of drugs or devices or product areas or theories that they're pushing for. And this is pretty obvious when you think that there are government positions on the safety of established therapies that are being called into question. Previously, plaintiffs may have not thought it was a great idea, put a lot of effort into suing over those things. Certain vaccines that were really thought of as being safe. We could do a whole other topic about maybe the future of the Vaccine Act or how that all fits together. But, some of these like sacred cows, everybody knows this is an established safe drug used for 40, 50 years. And now there are new, statements from the government, various aspects of it, official, unofficial, whatever, that basically call that into doubt. And it makes it more of a pro-litigation environment for these sorts of companies to fund the plaintiffs' lawyers to go out there and get their clients. And it also encourages them to go after some new targets. I think what we've seen with some of the recent developments, I think, Sara referred to some of the efforts in software. Megan talked about privacy issues. There is a lot of interrelation here. And there's a very big litigation going on right now relating to social media. There are a couple of kind of spin-off sorts of litigations relating to AI and who you target. But those litigations pretty easily you can see how they would make it easier to sue other entities in the chain. Somebody who helped develop the product, somebody who wasn't the actual seller. So there are going to be new targets, both in terms of products that people are going after, but also maybe the types of companies and entities and pockets that they go after. Now, when I say that there's chaos that spurs litigation, I don't think this is that hard to see if you understand where litigation has come from in the past. When FDA is bobbling around between different positions, or when enforcement actions come and go, that lack of predictability does make it hard for companies to defend the cases. It just makes it harder. There's less predictability. If you look at the timing of when some of the large litigations have come up, the 3 of the 5 largest current litigations going on in the country all basically came up, got their MDLs for what it's worth during the first Trump administration, and they're still kicking around. Times of, discord, changes in how things are going on does help to spur litigation, even though plaintiffs understand that, maybe several years until the payoff at settlement and paying back their funders. Now, more direct impacts of some of these changes can be seen in both preemption. Companies that make FDA-regulated products love preemption when they get sued to the extent that they can use it, and in expert challenges. And I'll summarize it a little bit because you could go on for a while. But when a policy has changed, even if at the time, it was an approved product, there was no way FDA was going to approve the labeling change plaintiffs urged at the time. Post hoc changes do make that harder to win on. It's just going to affect the way judges think of it. It's going to make the judges a little, queasy to rely on something that may not be current FDA position. And we see the same sort of thing for expert challenges. A number of the large litigations relating to drugs, devices, vaccines over the last couple of years have had pretty good defense outcomes, frankly, because of successful challenges to general causation or broad-scale preemption warnings, almost always relying on essentially FDA doesn't think there's a connection here, or FDA's position was that this was not something you need to be warned about, for instance. Changes in that area, and when I say official or unofficial statements and positions under expert evidence, statements made from a podium are going to undercut somebody taking a position saying, hey, there's no causation here, this is not something that's accepted. And this ties a little to something we'll talk about later, that there are some changes in terms of the attitudes of judges and juries in this area, their deference, official and unofficial, to FDA, for instance, just some of the perception about science. Now, if you get as far as a trial in these areas, there definitely are changes. Some of the best defense evidence may not be admissible anymore because it's no longer what FDA thinks, for instance, or it's no longer what CDC has as its official policy about, how what the frontline therapies are for diabetes, for instance, harkening back to some old litigation I did a long time ago. And then, like I said, attitudes really change. How you would try a case in an area where science has taken a hit, the government's kind of sense of being deferred to has taken a hit. There are a lot of these changes. Corporate confidence is pretty low. It really does make it harder to defend these cases when you get to trial. And this all flows back to the idea that, this is probably a good idea, a good time for the investors and the plaintiffs' firms to get together and push new litigations. So we're going to go back to Megan with a little more on the impacts that she sees in the investigations area.
Yeah, and talking specifically as to False Claims Act, right? Because we're talking about litigation. And so I agree with what Eric said. I think he said pro-litigation. So yes, we are pro-litigation even under the False Claims Act. So just this week or last week, DOJ just issued its statistics. And we read about the statistics and it's always this eye-watering number, but it actually is an eye-watering number. We've got $6.8 billion of recoveries in 2025, and the vast majority of those are related to the healthcare sector. Now, that's the same headline that we get every year. Big recoveries, lots related to the healthcare sector. What is interesting is that a not insignificant portion of those recoveries in the healthcare sector are really large damage awards that are currently under appeal. So TBD, whether that's a legitimate approach to those types of damages. And so whether this is a trend that you all should be worried about is, are we seeing more and more large settlements under the False Claims Act? The other thing that, and I don't have the stats up here on the slide, but the number of qui tam suits that has been filed is astronomical. So last year, the total number of suits between qui tam and non-qui tam was about 1,400 suits. And that was a large increase. We reported on that. This year, the total number of just qui tam suits is 1,300. So we have a skyrocket of the number of qui tam suits that are coming out. Now, this is across all sectors, so defense, other, and healthcare, but still, the popularity of the qui tam mechanism is not lost on folks. Now, could it be cabined? Yes, we have Zafarov coming around the corner. For those of you who've heard about it, it's a constitutional challenge to the right of a private citizen to bring a suit on behalf of the government. I listened to oral arguments that happened at the 11th Circuit. I don't know which way they're going to go. I thought everybody had lots of interesting arguments, and I don't think that they were swayed one way or another. Could they say it's unconstitutional? Yes. And are we going to end up at the Supreme Court with that? Yes. So I think all of that is still what we're going to be seeing. The other area that you can tell from the statistics is that most of the cases, or more cases, I should say, are relator-led. So under the False Claims Act, you have this mechanism where the relator presents their case to the government evaluates whether or not they're going to intervene, and then they say, okay, yes, we're going to intervene, no, we're not going to intervene. The overwhelming majority of recoveries are in cases where DOJ intervenes, but there is an increasing trend of relators proceeding in the absence of DOJ and obtaining judgments at trial, and getting early settlements and large settlements, even in the absence of DOJ intervention, which is something to be aware of, because oftentimes, parties go through these False Claims Act investigations, and it's almost like a mini trial before a trial. You have experts and you have reports and presentations on the merits, discussions of damages, et cetera. And if there's no settlement, or if there's a decision not to intervene, usually people kind of wipe their brow and say, great, I'm done with it. But now we can't be assured that that is going to be the case, right? You have more and more relators going forward. And there's good relators counsel and there are not so good relators counsel. And oftentimes the adult in the room is DOJ, and not necessarily these relators counsel. And so it can be much more difficult to proceed in litigation with these parties. You add that to the fact that there is more and more litigation funding. So Eric mentioned litigation funders. We see it in the False Claims Act space also. And that leads to this increase of additional litigation when we're dealing with the relators. Some of these are predictions, and I can hold my powder for when we move on if we need to go. But I did want to say, at least in the litigation space, one thing that is not particularly evident from the slides is that there are resource restraints. These are priorities, and DOJ is committed to enforcing these laws and these rules, but they are strained, and their agencies are strained, and their enforcement capabilities are strained with resources in terms of funding and with people. And so there may be a premium on self-disclosure, more so than ever. And there may be a premium on cooperation, how many resources you can throw at the investigation in order to secure a settlement, and voluntary disclosure. These have always been the drumbeats, so it's nothing new, but I think the premium on that is even higher. So, Eric, I defer to you. I can keep going on some of the other points, or I can save them for later.
I think we're doing okay on time. We'll get to probably the last sort of free-form discussion on predictions. But so far, we've been talking about direct government actors, what agencies have changed and what's been going on, various statements from podia, from government officials, DOJ policies and practice, some of the tie to private litigation. Clearly, there's another leg to this stool, which is courts. And we'd probably be remiss if we didn't talk about that. We're now outside of our year, but late in 2024, there was a Supreme Court decision that really changed a lot of things in this area. And you see our cutesy little thing like, why is there a football coach in the top right screen? That's the famous Jim Mora playoffs. We're talking about playoffs. Here we are talking about deference. Now, pretty nerdy kind of legal concept, but it does have some ripples, I think, the way we see it. So just a brief recap. 1984, a Keystone decision that talked about deference to agencies acting within the scope of their authority, really technically within the Administrative Procedure Act space, challenges to rulemaking, that sort of thing, other agency actions. And so for a long time, agency actions got a lot of deference. And so it was hard to overturn them, no matter what you did, no matter what the agency, whatever. That started to erode. There was a decision, West Virginia versus EPA, a couple of years ago, and that I think foreshadowed, because it created something called a major questions doctrine, like when it's a really big issue, you don't need to defer. Along came Loper Bright, overruled Chevron, and now it's kind of, courts are supposed to decide what the laws mean, and that affects the ability to have agencies act in accordance with the law. I mean, I'm not going to go into every last interpretation, the different parts of the opinion, but it has a major ripple. And I think a lot of people look at this who maybe are FDA regulated product companies, for instance, or companies that get reimbursement from the government, and they look at it and they're like, oh, great, like it's easier to overturn these. Now that's the plus side. There's a little downside, but I think Juliet had an example of one of the ways that this is played out to make it a little easier for companies, given the change in the legal framework.
That's right. Thank you, Eric. We just wanted to highlight one case that came out last spring that really put to test this whole Loper Bright change in viewpoint. So the FDA proposed some pretty significant changes with respect to being able to have oversight of laboratory developed tests, LDTs often referred to, and these are tests that are conducted within a clinical setting only and not massively produced or marketed externally, and are really diagnostic in nature. And the long-standing history of these is that they've never been regulated by FDA because they are so limited, and they come under the auspices of CMS's sort of regulatory authority for clinical laboratories. But this enforcement got pretty far along, and last year, two core groups, the American Clinical Lab Association and the Association for Molecular Pathology, filed suit against FDA and won in the Eastern District of Texas. And the judge came down to the final ruling that FDA didn't have authority under the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act or under any other statutory provision to be able to come in and have sort of oversight or enforcement action of lab-developed tests. And this was pretty significant. And we were glad to see this in the healthcare context be applied in this way, because it kind of previews for us potential other opportunities to push back on authority that's going to come out and directly affect products in a way that makes sense, possibly.
So that's an example of something good for the companies, manufacturer side. The bad, I think, falls into two categories. Sometimes rules or authority or decision that have been in place for a long time that companies rely upon, think is good, the predictability we've talked about, get challenged by third parties. We saw this in the context pre-Loper Bright of there was a Alliance for Hippocratic Medicine, which challenged FDA regulatory actions over the course of decades relating to medication abortion in particular. Got up to the Supreme Court, was ultimately decided on standing, but part of the issue below, and I think what some of us at the time when this was percolating through the courts saw coming is, so FDA actions are subject to reevaluation, I mean, in that case, basically without deference, by hundreds of federal district judges. There are, 220 or so divisions of all the federal district courts within the country, multiple judges in most of them, hundreds of sitting federal judges, and there is the ability for these challenges to be brought and decided in different places, to have inconsistent results. It can be a little bit, to borrow somebody else's phrase here, a little Wild West if what you have is other kind of third parties challenging FDA decisions on, in that instance, essentially REMS packages, other kind of FDA actions. It creates a lot of unpredictability. The fuzzier impact in kind of something I've already talked about for product liability litigation, including preemption and other sorts of big legal issues that get cited in big drug and device product liability litigation, is so if courts don't really need to defer to agencies anymore, even if it's just the APA context, are they really going to get much deference when it comes to preemption or the integrity or the weight of their decisions or their statements, their, rejection, for instance, of a citizen's petition arguing that a label should be changed to add a new warning, and the FDA saying, no, the evidence in favor of that is pretty weak at this point. We're not going to require that. Pretty common thing, frankly, and pretty common thing to be evidence in the course of the litigation sort stuff that I do. Our court's going to be less likely to, again, put weight, defer, even in this sense, to actions by agencies that the companies like and rely on and would love to be critical to their success in litigation and various types of litigation, not just products. Now, the next thing that we wanted to highlight, and again, this is where some of this is a little fuzzy and some of it is borne out by research. Pew and other entities do a fair amount of surveys about public attitudes, and we have seen that there have been significant attitudinal shifts. During the height of the COVID pandemic, a lot of the, strongly held differences of opinion, let's say, about public health policy was getting debated and on the internet by people who said this is a good drug to use, even if it's not approved for this, even if it's approved for veterinary uses or something. This is what people think. Vaccines are really good. No, the vaccines aren't good because FDA is a pawn of the industry. All sorts of stuff like that played out very publicly and accelerated some of the pre-existing patterns that showed a drop in confidence in public health agencies, in corporations, and corporations in this space in particular. So way back in 2001, I think is when I saw there was a peak on this. The trust that in general the federal government will do the right thing from the research back then was over 50%, 54% of adults surveyed in this context generally trusted the government to do the right thing, which obviously includes the sort of agencies we're talking about. In 2021, a 20-year period again, after a lot of these COVID effects had played out, that had dropped to 21%. So in other words, 79% of people don't generally expect that the federal government will do the right thing, including when it comes to public health decisions. This has been paralleled by a significant drop in confidence in science, kind of what's the mainstream science. The little dude on the left, absorbed in his phone, he's down there looking at all these conspiracy theories and some influencers' take on, complicated scientific issues. There is a lot of research that supports that there is more acceptance of kind of fringe, unsupported theories, rejection of mainstream theories or accepted positions, more likely to kind of just brush away positions of FDA or CDC or other entities as being influenced by things other than actually what the science shows. Now, what impact does that have on litigation? Pretty obvious, I think, for just about all the things we're talking about, and certainly anything that gets to a jury, is that typically, I'm a little biased here, but typically the sorts of companies that we represent are on the side of science. They're like, this is why we have an approach to what this product should be on the market. This is the way the labeling should be. This is why, various actions that the company took are appropriate and reasonable in these different types of theories. That's a hard sell if people just generally don't trust companies, don't trust healthcare and life sciences companies, don't trust agency decisions, don't trust science, don't trust, august scientific institutions to do the right thing. And that is a significant change. It's not just because of COVID. It's not just the last 5-6 years, but it really has accelerated, and it does make it harder to do, essentially our job, and it makes the litigation environment overall be a little more unpredictable and maybe a little scary. And I'll say, I know Megan talked about viewing an 11th Circuit argument recently. I read some of a recent Second Circuit appellate argument that ties to one of these things, one of these issues. Listen, judges are people too, and we do have increasingly a younger and arguably, by traditional measures, less qualified kind of federal bench, right? They're subject to some of these same pressures. They have some of the same things, generational age, party, whatever, this different way that broadly, it used to be a sense in general, Democrats were less likely to have confidence in the federal government, Republicans were more likely. That's flipped, in general for most of the research we've seen. Judges are people too, and they have a lot of doubts. So what I highlighted here is that a couple of years ago, there was a very large litigation that was got a lot of attention attacking acetaminophen, the scientific name of Tylenol, it's paracetamol in Europe and some other places, alleging a link between that and autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. And a fairly well-qualified lead expert for the plaintiffs was knocked out entirely. There was no reliable basis for his opinions on general causation. Very thorough decision, essentially was a death knell to that litigation. That's what's up on appeal to the Second Circuit. Not long before that argument on the appeal, at least for that initial panel, that's when we started seeing different positions taken by the government that were very different than historic positions of FDA or HHS or anybody from the executive branch about these sorts of relationships. Caused, quite a bit of turmoil, I think, in this area. But you could even see it in terms of the appellate questions being asked, how this sort of change would affect things, even though legally, whether the decision of the judge at the time to exclude the evidence, that the opinions when formed weren't reliable, almost has nothing to do with changes in late 2025. You don't have this sort of post-wash, but you do have this impact because the judges think about this stuff and they are influenced in these ways. And I think that's one of the ways that I personally see there being connections in this area, that we're going to see more and more of these sorts of interconnections. And I think this is where we've gotten to I know some people have said along the way, we're maybe holding off as we talk about predictions, but here's where we're going to talk a little more on the prediction side, some of what we think is going on, big picture, and where we're going next. So this is where we go for a free for all, if you will. I don't know. I think Sara was probably going to start talking about where we are as a bottom line in the regulatory environment on the FDA and HHS side?
Yeah, we got a question about that actually goes to my point here about what do you do, how do you act under this administration if it's going to shift or something's going to change to the next administration. So I think we advise our clients to do the legal thing under whatever administration we're operating under, right? I think the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act has a 5-year statute of limitations. So you want to make sure like what you're doing today complies with that because there could be enforcement if you violate it today. But a good example of how to protect yourself for a change of tide or administration, FDA updated their clinical decision support software earlier this month, or yes, it's still January, that revised the guidance associated with clinical decision support software. And the 21st Century Cures Act a few years ago essentially removed some software from the definition of a medical device. And in this revised guidance document, FDA is saying, there are potential other software that could qualify as clinical decision support software and therefore not a regulated medical device if certain requirements are met. So what we advise clients on is if that is FDA's posture, if that is FDA's guidance, we need to follow that and document that because under the guidance, it's enforcement discretion. FDA is saying right now, under this, we are not going to take enforcement if you meet X, Y, and Z. So you as the device developer, what are you doing to ensure you comply with that? And what are you doing to document that you comply with that?
If I could piggyback on what you just said, Sarah, is it same advice under the False Claims Act, right? So you have a 5-year statute under the FFCA, but under the False Claims Act, you can have up to 10 years, right? And so you're going to span multiple administrations under that timeline. And whatever is required could have changed multiple times throughout that. And then it could have changed in material and immaterial ways, meaning regulatory guidance versus sub-regulatory guidance. And what is valid for a false claim, right? So there are multiple, and then not to get too detailed in the False Claims Act, but you've got state of mind, scienter, and you also have falsity. If you are following the guidance as written and it is regulatory guidance, no false claim, right? From a falsity perspective. But is it sufficient for sub-regulatory guidance to trigger whether something is false? That position tends to trend based on whoever's in the White House. There also tends to be a need to focus on the state of mind, because while it might not be relevant to whether something is false, it is relevant to what is your subjective understanding of the legal requirements. So I agree with Sarah, you need to document. So oftentimes you will, let's say you learn of a practice that may or may not comply with current positioning of a given regulator. You might conduct an internal investigation. Well, we all like to conduct our own internal investigations under privilege with the understanding that if there's a problem, we may have to disclose or deal with it, right? But if you are going to change your practice or maintain your practice because you have found it to be appropriate, you need to leave a breadcrumb that is unprivileged. Because at some point, if you are faced with a regulator or a private litigant or a qui tam action, you're going to have to demonstrate what you did in order to try to comply with those rules and what is your interpretation. And so is there a byproduct of your investigation that is public? And Eric, I see you're nodding. I'm hoping you're agreeing with me, but this is how I have focused on it because there's a lot of really big changes across lots of industries, not just yours, that could have significant False Claims Act implications depending on how it's read.
I mean, part of the reason I was nodding, being a good active listener, is that there's a funny issue that we've talked about here in terms of both of you mentioned statute of limitations. It's not at the top of everybody's mind as a hot issue, right? Statutes are statutes. But one of the things that I think that we will see, and I've seen some hint at it, is people making arguments to try to essentially revive what otherwise would be time-barred claims based upon a change in government position or the law. So it could be like, I never knew I had a basis to sue over this drug and this injury, even though I claimed to have had it from the drug, 10 years ago, until I heard that government official at the podium the other day. That's our trigger. They like to talk about you have like a triggering event to start the statute, when something happens, and government actions often are those triggers. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see people try to bring up, very otherwise stale claims. We saw that a couple of years ago in a litigation relating to a drug that was actually never marketed in the United States, but was marketed in Europe in the late 1950s and early 1960s. And, 50 plus years later, we started getting lawsuits of people saying, oh, I had no idea I could sue over essentially one of the most famous drugs of all time in terms of infamous thalidomide. So the plaintiffs' lawyers are certainly going to do what they can to get around statute, and this is one of those areas where it's going to come up. And relatedly, since there was talk about changes relating to software and AI, and is it a medical device? Is it not a medical device? Is it something that FDA regulates? Some of those changes and some of the changes in law that are probably going to be happening also can affect statute, where somebody can be like, I never knew that I had the ability to bring a tort-based lawsuit over software, because traditionally it's treated as a service, governed by contract principles, and people click away their rights and it's arbitrable. And now, oh, it's a product, or product liability claims out there for software as a medical device. That is some of the environment we're seeing. We're jumping between where we are now and what's coming next. I think that we are going to see increased litigation relating to these sorts of theories, including reaching back in time, which does make it hard, as Megan pointed out, for companies to make sure that you have all the right documentation in place for a long time to defend these cases when they get brought. Because normally you're like, well, I don't get sued for something that I made 30 years ago, but weird stuff like that might be coming out in the next couple of years.
Or they find new theories of liability, right? So for example, you have software, well, now you have cybersecurity and data privacy requirements that are all ever changing and different from state to state, et cetera. And so if you're gonna, one of the things that I mentioned is the cybersecurity task force, and that has been very active. And it applies at the medical device level, and we could see it happening with health apps, et cetera. And if you're not protecting that information that's within it, they're going to say, okay, well, maybe I can't sue under the theory that I wanted to sue under, but now I have this new little like jurisdictional hook for something that is an enforcement priority, which is protection of data and cybersecurity of information.
Yeah, and I don't want to cut off Julia. I think she had a point, but the new theory thing is definitely something that's been going on for a couple of years now. I'm sure there was some law school professor who first said it, bad cases make bad law. And one of the things that makes bad law in terms of expanding theories of liability is this sort of idea that it's unfair that somebody is not going to be liable for a large social or public harm. So we saw in opioid litigation some expansion of liability, not necessarily for very long. Some of the appellate courts disagreed, but there's been an expansion of the public nuisance doctrine, which is a big hammer out there potentially for governmental costs. We've seen a renewed effort to try to get medical monitoring damages under certain theories. We saw advisors in opioid, a whole other litigation going against a company that advised one of the manufacturers on marketing, which is pretty weird because normally, you wouldn't get sued over that. You don't have a direct relationship, certainly, with somebody who's buying a prescription product or illegally obtaining a prescription product. So we have definitely seen in the products context, and like one step adjacent to products, Megan, an expansion of liability and theories of liability that have been pushed. And from what I've seen, it's largely been driven by, a way to try to pass off significant public expenses on private actors, even if the relationship is very tenuous or historically you never would have been able to make a public nuisance claim over a prescription medical product. Nobody would have thought that was a thing, for various reasons, including there's a bar for intervening criminal acts. I can't say we're exactly going to see that, but some of what's already been said here, as we talk about weird interconnections, is, Juliet mentioned attempts to save money, and that a lot of the government practices are based upon, cost savings and ways to improve public health while reducing costs and reducing government spend. Well, that could go pretty hand in hand with how can we make somebody pay for what we're expending? And I think that's, a logical next thing to come out of this.
Yeah. just following through on that thought, the logical next thing on how do we get payment back and how are they doing the cost cutting measures? We know for sure that there's upwards of like more than 3,000 audits that still have yet to come out on the Medicare side tied to certain product use. We know that there have been changes in coverage policies, even within the same administration. So we get client questions on how can we make sure that the services we provide will truly be paid for, or the products we're using are going to adequately be paid for when we're using them in a medical service. And I think Sara said something really good. Like we go back to the Medicare statute, what's reasonable and necessary. We go back to the efficacy of the use of the product and why it's needed for that individualized patient. But there are changes. We've had coverage policies that changed 3 times just in December for a class of products. Then finally on Christmas Eve, the administration came back and said, we're wiping out this whole limitation and go forth and conquer. So there are certain things that you can tell your clients really using your products and getting reliance on whether or not it'll be covered is just going back to the basic premise as to some of the things they've learned in the Medicare statute.
Yeah, I think we're now probably at the point time-wise to go on to our question phase, and we do have a couple of questions. I know, Sara, you addressed one. Why don't we go maybe to this next one? It is directed at you, but I know there may be some other wrinkles. There's a question here. Can you comment on why there's increased scrutiny by the FDA? Has FDA noticed a negative trend in terms of outcomes for patients or medications not being as effective as advertised? Like what's driving this from your perspective? There was another question here about FDA versus RFK Jr., but I think that's probably a little too, getting into psychoanalysts.
I'll just tackle them both, actually. So
Yeah,
I actually think FDA and HHS are collaborative. So just throwing that out there. As to the increased scrutiny by the FDA, it's a really good question. And I don't have a great answer, except that I think the legacy FDAers who are still there, and they were hurt under Doge. I think morale, personnel, they were hit hard. The legacy folks feel that it is their job to ensure that the public is safe. And so I do think that in part has increased some enforcement in some areas. I think other enforcement is administration down, right? We want to cut drug pricing, and therefore we're going to make statements about drug advertising and whether or not be truthful or misleading. And the increase of the CRL, so FDA essentially denying the application, I think is because the agency doesn't have the staff or the technical experts that maybe they once did or need to really be conscious and thoughtful about responding to sponsors.
I mean, there was data recently about the number of doctorate level hard science people that have left the administration over the last year, and it's thousands and thousands, and that's certainly true within HHS as well as various others. So, not to get into a whole different thing about brain drain, and there were resource discussion earlier. I know Megan talked about them having to pick where the resources are allocated from a DOJ perspective. Clearly, there are resource issues in various aspects of government right now in terms of traditional career employees and people with terminal degrees that provide a specialty to evaluate a certain part of an NDA or PMA, for instance.
On the comment about who can get sucked into the liability, I know that we've sort of talked separately. Enforcement actions are also seeking to push out. So anyone who's touching what's going on, whether that's a private equity, whether that's an individual, enhanced individual enforcement, whether that's a consultant, parties that are involved in decisions that impact whatever the enforcement regime is that we're dealing with, whether it's like off-label marketing, your extra beers on your FDA approval lane, whether it's a product failure issue. Parties that are involved, if they have awareness or have ability to effectuate change, impact compliance, those parties are being looked at. And they're being looked at criminally, civilly, and administratively.
I mean, it'll be interesting to see what happens with this, but one of the big attempted new theories of liability that has not taken, gained any foothold outside of California or Massachusetts is this idea that the company that develops the initial technology to create a product or even product line, the original NDA holder should be liable for people downstream, even if they don't hold the NDA anymore, a way to get around some of the preemption defenses available to generic drug manufacturers, for instance, a sort of innovator liability. That is one way where you say, I'm not going to be able to get much money out of this target, or they're going to have really strong legal defenses. There's somebody out there who's even a little more peripheral where you're going to target them. Clearly that goes on in, enforcement activities and things like that, but it's going to happen and has been happening in products. Most of those new kind of targets and new theories have not succeeded so far, but I mentioned them as being like sharks. The plaintiffs' lawyers in this space, they also don't give up very easily. So they're going to keep going and going until they get a foothold with some of these new theories. And I would imagine, not to jump into somebody else's area, but I think it's plausible that it's the same thing when it comes to people who are looking to prosecute or push a government investigation position for, establishing kind of a new law or new precedent. They have the ability to a little bit control their venue and where they really push arguments to a conclusion.
One of the things that Juliet said earlier was talking about CMS's use of AI. I just wanted to say, like, what's coming next. It's an expectation that parties use their own data and their own AI affirmatively. So if you have information about your product and you are not assessing your data, that is a compliance risk for you, and it is going to be called out as you had this data and you didn't look at it, or you had the ability to assess something and you didn't look at it. And as a result, you have caused harm in whatever forum we're talking about. But parties need to be aware of the pockets of data that they have available to them and the ability to analyze them, whether that's through AI or otherwise.
So I think we're pretty much bumping up against the end of our time, and we've tried to answer the questions online or orally, but I don't know if any of you, Sara, Juliet, Megan, have any, parting remarks. I think that we have seen that there is quite a bit of interconnection here that probably, I don't know, speaking for the four of us, there's even more than I thought when we started the recording an hour ago. There's just a lot out there that is connecting and a lot in flux.
Well, thank you all so much for your time today. Eric, Megan, Juliet, Sara, your expertise is going to be so valuable for our listeners. This is a products liability landscape that is shifting on what seems to be a near daily basis, and hearing about the intersection of all of your areas of expertise and the impact on this topic will be very helpful to our audience. So again, thank you all.